I am so excited to be here in Iowa and excited to talk about this subject. I'm often asked about partisanship and where it began, and the truth is that it began before the country existed, and certainly took hold before the Constitution was even written. When Washington assumed the presidency, his reputation was beyond reproach. Everywhere he went, the public celebrated him. Everyone he met respected him, and they wanted to be his friend. They seemed eager to serve him in any capacity. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but he had a mule, and mules were illegal. The King of Spain did not export them, so it was sort of his biggest flex in early America. And that was just one of them, but it was, we were an agrarian society. He had a mule. It was a big deal. And by the time he left office, half the country considered itself politically opposed to him. Which is all to say that it isn't new. Partisanship has always been here. It hasn't necessarily been that bad, though. So we're going to review how it started and where it ended up before he died. So as you see, I have a chart here, and I've blacked out, we'll look at it again at the end of the talk. What I have here is quotes from different founders. I'm grouping in Thomas Paine because he was integral to the revolution, and particularly to Washington. And as you can see, it's a lot of laudatory statements, praise. John Adams says, I glory in the character of Washington because I know him to be an exemplification of the American character that was really important to early America. He had to be good, and that meant that we were good. Thomas Jefferson goes on and on. We produced a Washington. His memory will be adored. Thomas Paine, I'll never suffer a hint of dishonor. James Madison, the conduct of Washington does equal honor to his prudence and to his virtue. And James Monroe, I have boundless confidence in him, nor have I any reason to believe he will ever furnish occasion for withdrawing it. Now you can see that I have the things that they will say about him after, and then I have their final relationship status. So I can't really see you, but I wonder how many of you think that they ended up, right before Washington died, still being friends? Do you think it was sort of, clap if you think it was half, if he was still friends with half the founders? Go ahead, clap. Okay. All right, remember the level of that. So, in 1786, Washington was happily ensconced at Mount Vernon, his historic home, his forced labor camp, and he was watching from afar, but he had no intention of returning to public life, to public service. He had felt like, okay, I really did my time. The revolution was 8 years long. I am happy to be home. When he gave up power, it wasn't a symbolic act as we now appreciate it to be. I mean, it was, and it set the tone. But he wanted to get home. He'd been writing to Jefferson and people who were in charge of the transition for some time, asking, when can it happen? When can it happen? I really want to be home by Christmas. And he made it home by Christmas and said, I will never go farther than 40 miles from Mount Vernon again. The problem was that the North and the South were already fighting. America had failed to pay back British debt, so after the war, we owed them money. And they weren't treating loyalists, the people who had remained loyal to the British, well. And so the British were retaliating. This was really their public campaign to win back the hearts and minds, because remember that the British and the French were now fighting. The American Revolution caused an age of revolution, inspired it, but also caused a lot of the early republics to fight each other. And so the British Foreign Secretary had let this be known that the Americans were already failing. Their young republic, it wasn't going to make it without them. Through these sort of stream of embarrassing and very public correspondence. But then it was also very clear to everyone that the British were threatening Americans just with their very presence. So they occupied forts in New York. So imagine you won a war, but the people you'd won the war against hadn't left yet. They were in forts in New York and the Northwest Territory, which is bordering the Great Lakes, so it's the region that eventually became the states of Ohio and Michigan. And so the real problem was that the North and the South couldn't agree on taxes. And you can't pay debts if you can't collect taxes. So I take it everyone's in Hamilton, so I can kind of speed through this part, right? Yes. So we all know that there was a dinner, there was a meeting, they went in. The thing is, the one thing I will say is, when they go into the meeting, it's not like there is no precedent for them coming out together, because while they might disagree on a lot of things, they always agreed on America. So remember that they had, written quite a lot before they were when basically the Articles of Confederation was not working. And they were hoping to meet for the Constitutional Convention, but they needed a president to preside over it. And Washington was asked to do so by Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, Jefferson, everyone. And Washington said, no, we are either a united people or we're not. He writes that to Madison in 1785. Because America, in his mind, and in the mind he thought of everyone else, was supposed to succeed without one person. It was never supposed to have a king. There was not supposed to be some sort of dominant church or like a military leader. And it's certainly in his mind, at that point, he was 54, he was arthritic, he had blurry vision, he had foggy hearing, and I think 2 teeth at that point during the Constitutional Convention. By the time he's inaugurated, he has just 1 left. And very limited cash flow. So he's not really excited about this. And he also has nothing to prove, and as I said, everything to lose. He's the most famous, most respected man in the entire world. They didn't let up. And they said that by showing up to the Constitutional Convention, which he did, and he barely spoke, and they got rowdy, he would stand up. But the problem was, there was so much to figure out about the country and what was wrong, that they thought, okay, well, if he's here, he's on stage, that means he's probably going to be president. So we can leave so much about the presidency kind of vague, and he'll figure it out. And everyone will just follow what he does for all time. It didn't quite work out that way. So Washington becomes president. He calls the process of going to the presidency, going to New York, which was the site of the first seat of power. The second was Philadelphia, while the White House was being built after the compromise. And he calls it going to the site of my execution. So he's very much resigned to this. He's not excited about the power. But again, America was born with so much wartime debt that it was enough to really crush it in its infancy. It owed $40 million to its citizens. And they had loaned money to America during the war. $25 million to individuals around the world. And of course, France didn't just want money. They had helped us win the war. And it was now in the throes of its own revolution. So there was a lot of pressure from our greatest overseas creditor to join them against the British. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, was in charge of solving this problem. So they have this dinner. They had worked together on the Federalist Papers. They did it again. They came to a compromise. Great news. The debts will be paid. Yes and no. There were regional tensions that had already started to flare. So regional tensions were the beginning of partisanship. The Southerners had almost paid off the entirety of their debt by the time they met for that dinner. They paid it off, of course, through slave labor. And then the North did not have as much. They had plenty, but not as much. But they thought, okay, that's fair. We should have no debt because it looks like the seat of power is going to be in New York. Come up with this compromise. It will be in what is known as Foggy Bottom, where Washington, by the way, owned a lot of property. The presidency was always somewhat transactional. And he decides that he will enter office without declaring a political party. The political parties, however, are starting to form. He was sympathetic, and he remains the only president who has never declared a political party. The political parties had started to form. He was definitely sympathetic to Federalists. He had a political affiliation to them, but not formal. Hamilton was his political affiliation. Jefferson always felt like he sided with Hamilton, and it wasn't just that he favored Hamilton, which he very much did, so he also agreed with him in every way. The Constitution doesn't mention political parties. This is important. It's not until 1804 that the runner-up in the presidential election was automatically made vice president. So parties were also at odds with Washington's goal of unity. It wasn't supposed to be about a person, and it wasn't supposed to be about a party. It was supposed to be about a country. That was supposed to be the unifying figure in everyone's life. So these two disparate visions of America emerged very early on. We have the Democratic Republicans, Madison, Jefferson, Monroe. They want limited federal government. They want state governments to be really strong. They want the Constitution to be pretty literal, and they're decidedly anti-British. Jefferson was famously a Francophile. Monroe, we'll get to that later, was the first ambassador to France. The Federalists, on the other hand, want a strong central government. They want the Constitution, though, and this sounds like it doesn't necessarily go together, but it does, to be interpreted rather expansively. Decidedly pro-Britain, again, kind of confusing because we just fought a war with them. An anti-French revolution, mostly because it was messy. We had an allegiance to them and didn't want to get involved. So Washington decides that, he needs to check in with his cabinet. The Constitution did not allow for a cabinet because it sounded a little bit too much like Parliament, and Parliament was, in the minds of the founders, the problem. They still were kind of mad at the king, but in their hearts they still believed that Parliament was the one driving this, and actually it wasn't. The king was pretty unsympathetic to the cause, he knew exactly what was going on, but it's the power of propaganda. If you grew up in a colony, the colonies actually didn't speak to each other. They were kept as isolated as possible, because what happens when people band together, there's power. And also they were surrounded by these emblems of, and portraits, all sorts of signifiers of the king. And so they had this affection for him. And even when they're railing against, with the First Continental Congress, when they're railing against Parliament, they're still sending the king these adoring, letters full of hyperbole about how they serve him and they love him with all their heart. So Washington decides, okay, I need some sort of group of people who can get back to me really quickly, because he goes, the Constitution did allow the president to go to Congress, to consult with Congress, but he went there, he had sent his questions in advance, and he got there and everyone was sort of hemming and hawing, and some of them had never seen him in person, and they were kind of odd, and a lot of them just didn't really know how to govern yet at such a large level. They had almost all, had some experience in government at the lower levels in their various villages, towns, municipalities, colonies, and then eventually states. But they knew that this was sort of a big deal. So he had asked about a treaty, the first treaty with the Creeks, and they had nothing for him, and so he got very frustrated, and he stormed out of Congress and said, "I'm never coming back here again." It's not totally true. The president has to give a few addresses, but he never went back for advice. And so what he did was he invented the cabinet. He took all the leaders, his Secretary of State, and he basically invited them for one of 8 meetings during his 8 years. Now, it's really important that we take a look at who was in this cabinet. This is what we would now call a bipartisan cabinet. There are Democratic Republicans and Federalists, but of course Washington is not excited about these affiliations, and so he doesn't really think of them in that way. When he invites them in 1791 to come to his house to meet in person, he has 2 Virginians, 1 New Yorker, and 1 New Englander. So to him, that's diverse. And he feels like that'll give him the best range of viewpoints that he can get. Notably absent, of course, is John Adams, who had never shaken his reputation very early on for loving all things monarchical. The latest gossip was that he rode with no fewer than 6 horses, and he wanted to be a member of the royal court. And that was enough in early America to kind of take your other running. So this is considered a bipartisan cabinet. I also love their occupations before the Revolution. Now we tend to think of politicians having been lawyers, but we have booksellers here, we have bookkeepers, we of course have a lawyer and a plantation owner. So Washington would hold these 8 meetings, and they are what sounds like hellish experiences. Washington had been a part of a group of colonists in Virginia who had some say in local government, but not a lot. When they protested against tea tossers in Boston, they were immediately disbanded. And they, so he's used to being a general, and he's used to asking different people like Hamilton, who served as his aide-de-camp during the war, during a part of the war, to come and give him opinions. He would watch them fight, and they would say, okay, thank you so much, here's my decision, because he's the general. And then you cannot go out into the world if you are in an army, if you're fighting a war, and then say, oh, I really disagree with it, I don't, and fight against it. That is it, that's the final word. It doesn't work like that when you're in government. And so in these discussions, this was a moment for me when I found this quote by Jefferson, which wasn't, I was sort of surprised. Sometimes in books everyone quotes the same quotes, and this one I had not seen. Jefferson wrote later, in these discussions, Hamilton and myself were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. When I read that, that was so illuminating, because that means that this isn't a meeting where people are getting heated and they're yelling at each other. This is a blood sport. Washington is the referee, but he wants this to happen, and Jefferson and Hamilton are like razor-beaked competitors. This is a fight to the death. And in 1792, of course, their fight spilled out into the streets, because Jefferson and Madison, who were these ideological allies, they were quietly funding a paper called the National Gazette, and it criticized everything Washington. It criticized his policies, it attacked the Federalists. He, in his first term, was too popular for people to come at him directly, and so just as they had blamed Parliament for misleading the king, they now blame Washington and his seemingly favorite advisor for just about everything and misleading him. And Hamilton was already promoting and perhaps backing, we still don't know, another paper called the Gazette of the United States. So we have these kind of like, imagine a Fox News and MSNBC situation. And what I do love is they all use pseudonyms. So Hamilton would sometimes write under the pseudonym An American. And then my favorite is Porcupine, and it was pretty prickly. None of these publications, by the way, even bothered with the pretense of objectivity or balance. They were written, again, anonymously or under pseudonyms. It was commonplace. Nothing was fact-checked. Personal lives, everything was fair game. We have known about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson since the Gazette of the United States existed. And Washington goes through this experience still thinking, okay, but I will be the unifier. That is still who I am. I'm horrified by this criticism, but it's fine. It'll die out. It didn't die out because it turns out the public loves infighting. And similar newspapers launched all around the country. There is not a lot going on in the form of entertainment. When people start campaigning, all it takes is a ball rolling through town. That is thrilling. Everyone waits days. People camp out to watch a ball. So imagine these essays are being read aloud, and perhaps you're not literate, which is most of the country. This is really exciting stuff for you, and you're not hearing other opinions because everything, regionalism is coming into play here. So Washington does suspect that Jefferson, because he disagrees with everything that Washington eventually concludes, that he's probably behind these attacks, but he doesn't know, he can't confirm, and he's trying not to alienate Jefferson and everyone else. Hamilton is convinced of it. Hamilton is pretty sure. And he's trying to get Washington to believe this, but he feels like, no, this definitely isn't true. He writes these letters, Washington, to Jefferson and Hamilton days apart, begging them to kind of get it together, to get along. He writes this sort of cheesy note to Jefferson. He writes, the North and the South will hang together if they have you to hang on. And at the same time, all these people who disagree with him, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they are begging Washington to serve another 4 years. Nothing has been decided. So much has been accomplished in that first term. We didn't have a Navy, we have a Navy. A lot of bills were signed, a lot of things were produced, treaties were made, and from an economic standpoint, America was starting very strong, which is all Washington ever wanted during the war. But it's a problem because, again, the war, right? We started this incredible war with other countries and starting this revolution, and then we have the president of France. So we have the president of America and we have the king of France, and those are the leaders that would normally communicate during this time. But something has happened in France. The king has been guillotined. The king no longer exists. So Washington, being the pragmatic general that he is, calls an emergency meeting of the cabinet at his house in Philadelphia, and he sent 13 questions in advance. He always sent questions in advance, but there was one that was most important. America, he said, had signed a treaty with France in 1778, but that treaty had been signed by King Louis, who was now dead. So we probably didn't need to honor the treaty, right? He wanted to declare neutrality, and that was so that America could freely operate, because the open seas now were a site of war. So if America, even though it wasn't directly involved in the war, was seen to be at all sympathetic to other countries, then it would be attacked, and it was regularly. So the people, though, on the ground had opinions about this too, because the French had this motto that was awfully similar to ours during the Revolution. Their motto was liberty, equality, and fraternity. It sounds a lot like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they had helped us, so it didn't make a lot of sense to people, even if they didn't agree with anything else that the Francophiles in government said. It kind of felt like, well, don't we owe them? Washington wasn't just being careful, and he wasn't just being savvy. He wanted to sell goods to both nations. The issue, however, split the cabinet down the middle, and it was more ferocious than ever. Henry Knox was often his own ideological corner, but he was an Anglophile, and so he sided with Hamilton. Jefferson was very much aligned with, obviously, Madison, Monroe, but what was surprising is he changed his mind. After a while, Jefferson decided that America should play coy. France and Great Britain could come to them and make an offer, and American loyalty would go the highest bidder. Washington did not accept that. So Jefferson, however, did emerge with a diplomatic win. He agreed to receive the first ambassador to France from the French Republic. But the first ambassador to America. But when Genet arrived in 1793, he didn't go straight to Philadelphia. When an ambassador arrives, you go and you pay your respects to the president. Instead, he went on this grand tour because, of course, it wasn't lost on the French that Americans could be rude. And he's basically he's openly campaigning for Americans to defy their president, to defy Washington. Washington does not like this. And he gets mad at Jefferson. And Washington, at the time, he was always plagued by some sort of illness. He was slowed, so he could really stew about it. And he starts to write to Jefferson, and he's getting more explicit, like, I know you're behind a lot of this. I know you're behind a lot of this. And Jefferson starts to write to Madison to say, like, I'm pretty uncomfortable here. I might have to leave government. He wrote in a letter, little lingering fevers have been hanging about him for a week or 10 days and have affected his looks most remarkably. He's also extremely affected by the attacks made and kept upon him in the public papers. I think he feels those things more than any person I have ever met with. I am sincerely sorry to see them. I remember that observation of yours made when I first went to New York, that the satellites and sycophants which surrounded him had wound up the ceremonials of government, so they're talking about Hamilton, to pitch a stateliness that had nothing to do with his personal character. It could have never been supported. No character after him will be able to maintain this. So they're saying that we had so aggrandized him. And that was before the cherry tree story was invented. So this is during his lifetime. This is during his first term. So eventually, even Jefferson is like, oh, Genet, please go home. This is embarrassing. And they cannot talk him into staying. And so we have this, the first cabinet, as I said, was completely bipartisan. That is not the case during the second cabinet. So you can see everyone, he's in an echo chamber. And then Jefferson has left government. When Washington decides to leave after 2 terms, he wants to go back. He feels like he's getting even older. He's outlived every man in his family, but really he's done. He does not like being criticized. And this is what Jefferson has to say as he departs. The president is fortunate to get off just as the bubble is bursting, leaving others to hold the bag. Sometimes these letters are remarkably modern sounding, and this is definitely one of them, because you can hear the resentment, and this is always true, right? When there's a president who's incoming, he's like, well, I'm inheriting all these problems. No, I didn't create this problem, I was just stuck with it. And then he goes on to say, he will give his usual good fortune of reaping credit from the good arts of others, and leaving them that of his heirs. His supporters stayed loyal, even through the end of his presidency, and that final winter was a real tour. There were social events thrown in his honor. But it was a little bit rough in Congress. A young Andrew Jackson, a young member of Congress, new to the House of Reps, did not stand on Washington's birthday to applaud him. So it was getting a little bit testy. And then Washington goes home and the tell-alls begin. So just as in our era, there were plenty of tell-alls. But before he goes home, he now, I feel like I've talked about his farewell address more in the last 8 years, for obvious reasons, than I have, in a long time before that. But what was interesting is so much of it has to do with political parties. And it wasn't delivered in Congress because Washington said it wasn't for Congress, it was for the people. He already thought that people in Congress were addicted to power. This is by the end of the first 8 years of the Constitution as we know it, and the government as we know it. And he wrote it to my friends, that was who he addressed it to, and he had it published in newspapers. So you can imagine those scenes where all these things had been read for or against him, and he wanted them to hear him. And he went on tours as well. He went on a southern tour and a northern tour, but this was really his attempt to reach out to everyone. He said, I'm worried about foreign influence. I'm most worried about political parties, because if they only serve power, they no longer serve their constituents. And they will do whatever this person says and whatever their party needs to maintain power, and then you're just paving the road for despotism, is what he called it. It was interesting, around President's Day, I wrote a piece for Slate, where I had, just on a whim, because I have talked about this and written about it so much, and every President's Day it's like a sort of, it's as close as I ever come to like a rager. It's like a week-long thing for me. And I wanted to approach it in a different way, so I started revisiting the early drafts, and what I found were these excised lines, so these cut lines. And not only does he talk about, it's an aside here, but not only does he talk about partisanship, of course, but Washington cut these lines that would really speak to us today, where he said, it will happen if America ever goes down, if it ever becomes a victim of despotism, it's because not only of political parties, but a group that's totally disinterested. There will be 2 other, of course the military, if anyone gets the military, it's over. But there will be another group, and it's not that they ran for power. They don't have the kind of power that we tend to think of right now. They don't have political power, they don't have military power. But they were either born into money, or they made money, or they have some sort of influence. And the problem with those people is they will get in with the president. People will be surprised to learn of these roles, and they will have, they'll be all about deals, and they will not have the same ties to government as people who come through traditional routes well. So one of the second, Randolph was a member of Washington's cabinet the first time around, wrote the first one, but my favorite is the second one by James Monroe. Washington had appointed him to be the first ambassador to France during the French Revolution, pretty exciting time. And then he recalled him. And recalled is a really lovely way to say he fired him. And that happened in 1796. And it really helped raise Washington's blood pressure. He was not doing great health-wise, when a year after he was recalled, Monroe published a book called A View of the Conduct of the Executive. So it's basically like a burn book. He's saying this is a critical book on president in foreign affairs of the United States. It was 473 pages. that just took Washington's administration to task. And it was a defense of himself, of Monroe, because he had been recalled. Obviously, it sort of worked because he then became president. But Washington rarely responded to criticism in writing. And so as a biographer, as a researcher, this is a real gift. It exists in the Houghton Library. It is a copy of this book by Monroe that Washington got his hands on, and he annotated in the margins. And his annotations are so good. And like literally from the first line, Washington is going after him. The first line is, in the month of May, so it's like a nothing burger of a line. In May 1794, I was invited by the President of the United States to the Secretary of State to accept the offer of the minister. And he goes on and on. And Washington scrawls in the margin, after several attempts had failed to obtain a more eligible character. Now, I just have a few samples here. These are good. So 1, fourth, my appointment to the French Republic with the circumstances. I tend to do a pretty vague line, right? Unfortunate one it was. This, again, for Washington, we don't have anything else like this. That's how significant it is. He got rid of things he thought would not age well and kept other things that he thought would. He was not right on a lot of it. Because of course we have him trading enslaved people, talking about how to watch someone, sending, all sorts of things. 2, I resolved, therefore, to stand firm at my post, curious and laughable. 3, I showed, it's true, no mark of undue condescension to that government. This is one of my favorites. Few will be of this opinion who reads this book. And then 4, but by this attack, a new topic has been raised for discussion, which has drawn public attention from the conduct of the administration itself. Self-importance. He's not a fan. So much so that on Thursday, December 12th, 1799, which is one of Washington's last moments upright, he's gone out, he's got this really long to-do list when he returns to Mount Vernon after he leaves office, and he thinks, okay, this will take 2 years. And he's a micromanager. I always say I pity the fool who works with Washington or his mother. They are not fun. They are exacting, they are demanding, and they are controlling. And so he has to go out and he has to ride around his 5 farms and supervise every little thing, including felling trees. And so he got sick because he was late for lunch and he didn't want to change clothes. He didn't want to upset Martha. It's the biggest meal of the day. And so he went and he sat through lunch in these wet clothes, and he'd been out all day riding. So he gets pretty sick that night, and he's hoarse. And he asked Tobias Lear, who was his longtime secretary, who had actually just married their niece Nellie, who lived upstairs, to read to him from the papers. And Washington is in really good spirits, according to Lear's letters, which are great from this time. I have a whole chapter on his death, and it's kind of amazing. But he's showing him the latest from the Virginia Assembly, and James Monroe, had just been elected governor with Madison's backing, which, according to Lear, left Washington much affected. He spoke with some asperity on the subject, Lear reported, which is a polite way in the 18th century of saying he cursed a lot. And it was so bad that Martha went to bed. She's like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And so again, we have the chart that I showed you at the beginning, I think. Can't really see. Yes, we have the chart that I saw. So as you see, there were I think probably half the audience clapped and thought that they were friends at the end. As you see, he was only friends with John Adams because he didn't involve him in government. He was estranged from everyone else. Now let's review these. By the time he died, even Adams said that he was illiterate and unread for his station. Illiterate was a way of, it was actually, so it's a way, it's like a class judgment. Ron Chernow called Washington's mom, Mary Washington, illiterate, which wasn't true. She just, didn't read novels. She was the daughter of an indentured servant. And that's a story I really wish we talked about more often about Washington, that he was the grandson of an indentured servant. It's quite an American story. But by the end, he was saying he was too illiterate. And if Washington had been alive for this, it really would have hurt him, because he was so self-conscious of what he called his deficient education. He had he hadn't been to Harvard or William and Mary or any of those colleges that the other founders had been to drop out when he was 14. He couldn't afford to feed his horse so that he could get to his half-brother's home so he could, hobnob with the elite. Things were pretty dire. He was an autodidact. He was really interested in learning. What I love is after the Second Constitutional Convention, he's been named the general, but he hasn't been in the army or certainly led any sort of big army. He led the Virginia militia when he was fighting for the British, because at first Washington wanted to be at the center of his nation's story. He didn't really care which nation that was. And so he picks up these books on the way out, and they're basically like how to war, like how to general. So he's always reading, and he creates this, this 18 sidebar. He's a really curious person, but he's not traditionally educated. Thomas Jefferson goes on. He was unready, short, and embarrassed. Thomas Paine, this was something, I will never suffer a hint of dishonor. Thomas Paine ended up, because he revolution hopped, he ended up in a French jail, and he wrote to Washington. Washington was remaining neutral, which meant that he could not help Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine did not take that news well, and this was from a public letter. As to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship, for you have so been to me, and in the day of danger. Like, that's not already pretty clear. And a hypocrite in public life. The world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles, or whether you ever had any. James Madison started out, the conduct of Washington does equal honor to his prudence and to his virtue. Washington's conduct is improper and indelicate. And then, of course, James Monroe. The labors of your more early life contributed to promote the liberties of your country, but those your later days to enthrall and enslave it. So saying you basically blew it when we saw who you were. And that, never ended. Partisanship, by not banning it, but by ignoring it, by letting it get out of control, Washington more or less endorsed the partisanship that we have today. At the same time, you can blame him, and you can also say that he set out to have, by having a virtue of having a bipartisan cabinet, he set out to have as many diverse voices as he could. He was a good general in terms of management. He didn't win, he lost more battles than he won, both, in government and on the battlefield, but he was an excellent manager, and he was really good at empowering people who worked for him, and that's a very important marking of a good president. But he was not good at managing this situation, and he was very sensitive. So there's a lot of talk about, I said that we don't have these kinds of verbose, we don't have these clapbacks from Washington. And we also don't have these beautiful words. He's not a Jefferson, he's not a Hamilton, he's not a Lincoln. We don't have great speeches. But we have this legacy, and a part of this legacy is partisanship. But the founders never expected us to take everything that they did and they said and just continue it in an unasking, uninquisitive form, and also one that did not adjust to the ages. There are many letters, many diary entries in which they talk about the Constitution being reworked. They thought that it would evolve with us. And so there is this push and pull with America, with partisanship, with the presidency, where we both want to stay true to some of our core values and also have failed to evolve in ways that Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Monroe, even Thomas Paine envisioned for us. There are three things that I like to think about, and then we'll go to a Q&A, when I think about the country, and particularly when we think about our 250th, which starts in July and will extend until July 2026. That we can hold three things at once. We can be proud of the founding. We can look at it and have a reckoning for the ways that we've fallen short. And we can aspire towards a better future. Thank you.
Thyman. In fourth grade, we went to the public library, and
I know we can talk about the Thyman. The Thyman is something I never intended to have in the book, but was in the book and is probably the thing that will be the first line in my obituary. It is, it's shorthand for what I felt like the Washington biographers who were, I'm the first woman historian to write a biography of Washington in over 100 years. And we stopped counting at that point, but it might be longer. There have been 2 women, a novelist and a travel writer, who wrote short, informal biographies. But otherwise it's been dominated by men, and sort of the funny thing is I feel like they're romance novels. Like there's a lot about, they really fixate on his thighs, the way they grip the flanks of a horse. But then Ron Chernow and other people, they talk about him in ways that like I feel are uncomfortable, like a little bit embarrassing. They talk about his rippling jaw and the muscles, and so this has become shorthand, so it's something that will be said to me for the rest of my life. So yes, continue, sorry.
the Thyman.
Yes, the Thyman.
We peruse, and if I was in fourth grade, Dad, he'd be like, team of rivals, you know, like, right?
Yes.
So in the beginning of your book, you talk about, you notice these Washington books, and you're looking at the names, and this is where you come to the realization, like, in the last few years, like, women have written about Washington. So how do you settle, what inspired you to write about Washington?
So I didn't actually realize that until I was a couple years into it. I knew I'm a presidential historian. I exist in these worlds. I've written a book before this. I was very aware that there were few women. I had no idea, because women do write books about Washington. There are books about, Martha Washington and Mary Washington's mother. And sometimes a husband and wife will work together. It'll be the husband's name like with the woman, or occasionally co-author. But they're just not a lot. And then one day, I do this every so often. This sort of keeps things fresh. I moved my desk. Now I do it on purpose. I moved my desk, and so I rearranged my books. When I rearranged my books, I was like, oh, these are all men. And then I wrote to Mount Vernon, a woman who just retired, Mary B. Thompson, and has been working there for many decades. And I asked her, it was a weird question because I was afraid it sounded, like it was just a question coming straight from my ego, onto the keyboard. And I said, but I thought I was missing something. There was probably like a really good perspective that I was missing, and surely, I don't know, it just was a really deep academic book. I just had missed it. She was stumped. We both wrote to the University of Virginia. We're all talking anyway. We all know each other, and it was true. And so that was a moment for me. But at that point, I already had Thyman written in brackets because I thought I'd come up with a far more respectful way to describe it. And I had gotten this sense that in presidential history, if you are a mother, you're either a saint, you've never done anything wrong in your entire life, or you are a shrew. And it's amazing that he achieved anything because you were just thwarting him at every corner, every stop. And there's not like a lot of room outside of that. And so I was aware of that. I was obviously aware that it was a strange fixation on his virility as well. There seemed to be a lot of backbending to ensure that we understood that it wasn't his fault that he didn't have children. That statement itself isn't true. People love to say he didn't have children. He did. They just weren't biological. But when he met Martha, she had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. She was a widow. And the best thing that could happen to you in early America was to meet a woman with children, because it meant that you had heirs. Biological connections are far more important to us than they ever were in early America. And it also meant that you probably have more. And Madison, a lot of the founders had children who were not biologically their own, and never had children who were biologically their own. But then they would say, well, it wasn't obviously he's virile. They would talk about how strong he is, as if there's some sort of connection, as if you couldn't have children as a man, you weren't virile. And they said there's probably something wrong with Martha because, if you have a hard childbirth, you can't have any more children. There is literally nothing to suggest she had a hard childbirth. There was nothing. In fact, it looked kind of easy, and she was ready for more. So I was aware of all these things, but after that moment, I thought, oh. And then I felt pressure, but I also, everything's a little bit scary. And the lovely part about writing a book and the position I was in then, which I'm not in now, is I could go to conferences, I could go to Mount Vernon, I could go to these things, and I could kind of be quiet. And people would think I was a grad student. I was often asked whose wife I was. Someone once handed me a drink, like to take it for them. And so it was nice, but I was aware, and it was a lovely moment of anonymity that I'll never regain.
Right, that's fine.
Yes, totally wrong.
I think, what's so impressive when I read your writing is your voice. So you're sharp, you're witty, you're authoritative all in one, which I find really impressive. And I think it can be hard to find your way and find your voice while also trying to compete, and maybe not compete, but everything that's been written before is thymic.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how you found your voice as a writer and kind of your rhythm in this particular biography?
In academia, you are supposed to write in a certain way, and that's the way I wrote for a long time, and it's still how my first drafts are, actually. So sometimes I'll send a first draft to an editor, and they'll expect something like really fun, and I'll say, this, I lay the foundation first, which is always rigorous scholarship, and then I can have fun with it, but I have to have that first. And then from there, unfortunately, I'm not really able to not be this voice. I think a part of it comes, I left, when I was in graduate school, I worked at the Brooklyn Historical Society as a graduate intern, and then a job opened up at the New York Public Library, and I left for that job. And one of the great gifts of that job was, and I left because I felt like academia, I once worked for like a year on a paper, and 2 people showed up in the audience at a very academic conference, which totally makes sense, but we didn't even get to the paper because it devolved to this debate about semantics that didn't make sense at the time. I couldn't even tell you about it now, and it made me sad. And so I worked in public history because you could see people interacting with the history. It was one of the greatest gifts is to sit in an exhibition that you have curated and watch people walk around. It's sort of like sometimes you'll see someone read the book on the subway, which is like the coolest thing ever, but you'll see them kind of flip through, and I wish I could see which pages are most interesting, and then they'll flip back, or they'll really linger, you can tell they're rereading, they'll annotate. That's really important to see how people interact with history. And what I realized at that point is my job was to tell them as much as I could, but that facts can be obtrusive to the experience of the reader. And so I had to figure out a way, and that's why a lot of the charts and graphs you saw are distributed throughout the book, because that's how I organize material when I'm doing the research, to make sure that I'm thinking about it dynamically as well. So I guess it's a part of the research, it's the rigorousness, and then it's also kind of reorganizing the material so that it becomes new to me, and that I can sort of understand it this way. I wanted people who were experts to read this book and be able to sort of learn something new, or to see they've missed something, or I wanted people who had never read this book. This was really a huge, I'm most proud of this, I think, of anything ever in my entire life, is that I wanted people who had never read a presidential biography, thought they weren't for them, have been really turned off by the writing style, to read it and feel like, oh, I can proceed as if I'm an expert because I have an expert because I have this information. And so I think it's a bit of understanding my audience, a bit of just sort of having, obviously, like a bit of a darkly funny, lens through which I view the world. And then finding that it really works in this medium, luckily, or else I don't know what I'd be doing.
I gotta say, the charts themselves, like, they're not even at times in your own words, directly from the primary source. Like, I found myself laughing out loud because of the way you juxtapose them. I'm just like, these are fantastic.
And each book needs to have its own sort of thing. So with Washington, because he is an Adams scholar, once described, when I said I was writing a book on Washington, he's so vanilla. And it's really, Adams are, really fun to read, we all know that. He needed this. Alice and Freed, my first book, needed primary sources to be illustrated. The next one is on Kennedy, and he needs something that's less sensational, a little bit more grounded in his academic and literary sensibilities and in bravery and such. And so everything just needs its own. You have to also listen to the subject, and you have to remember that they were a person, and that you need to respect who they were, that you see them on their best days and their worst days, and respecting someone doesn't mean agreeing with them. It just means that you have to respect them, you have to respect the source, and from there everything else flows.
I think it's clear you respected the sources you listened, and you gave us what the sources told. Now, before I totally run away with our conversation, do we have any questions? I know someone maybe volunteers. Yeah, we do. Great. Okay. Fantastic. I told them to be good history students and take good notes, ask good questions. We have Ken Burns question. So this is a question about Ken Burns' statement. Question, was Washington the greatest president? The quote here is, if there is no Washington, there is no America.
Absolutely. When people ask me, so it was really interesting. The book came out only a few weeks before the pandemic started, and I am quite fortunate, I feel like, because everything was just canceled. We didn't know what Zoom was at that point, so my book tours was sort of canceled. I feel really fortunate that it did so well. But I was, that was also a divisive time. And I was constantly confronted by two different groups of people. Of course, obviously it was bestseller, so I was confronted by people who liked it. But then the two people at the opposite end of the spectrum, which I love to actually contend with, people who say, I don't want to read about Washington, he enslaved people. Okay, well then you should read about him so you'll understand more about that and you can engage with it and also understand how it affects the present, which it very much does. And then at the other end of the spectrum was, I don't want to do anything but celebrate Washington because I'm afraid that he would be canceled. And my response to that is, best of luck. Like, I don't know how you cancel George Washington. You cancel George Washington, you could take down every school, like every school named after him, you could take down his name. The Washington Monument doesn't even have his face. It's just a huge phallic symbol. The Lincoln, it's true, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson, they all have limbs, they have eyes, they have words. There's absolutely nothing on the Washington Monument, and yet he looms large. You cannot have the country without Washington, without his presidency, but you can also say that about the war. The British had 8 different generals over 8 years who were far more accomplished and had done more, had devoted their entire lives to the military. But Washington was there for all 8 years, and that mattered. He was nothing else. Probably his greatest gift to America was that he was incredibly stable.
So this is a great follow-up to, Ken Burns says, without Washington there is no America. This question is, what would Washington think about his own legacy? He could, come back.
I think about this a lot. Yeah. I spent a night at Mount Vernon for my book launch, which is a great honor and a great privilege, but it's also, I know a little bit too much. It wasn't exactly an easy sleep. And I was thinking about the people who I had also just, it's an interesting crowd there, and I was thinking about that very restless night, and I think he would obviously be very, as we've just gone on, very sensitive to a lot of the criticism. I think he would be, most of all, though, really invested, and he would think that the attention on him was probably too much, but he would want us to engage with the principles more. And so I think that is, Washington, I would say, if he was the best at anything, and I think he was very, very good at a lot of things, but it's being in the right time, at the right place. But if I were to say something that he could win at any time in history, is just being, knowing when to go home, and also not needing to prove anything. He wanted so desperately to prove himself and to be wealthy and important. And once he achieved that, he was fine with it. He really could have retired after the war and never saw power again and lived a lovely, happy life.
Do you think, side tangent on that, is partially his upbringing?
I think the drive was a part of it. He was really eager, not only to never be in the position again to not be able to feed his horse, And he tried to give his stepchildren everything that he had never had, but he couldn't give them one of the most important gifts that you have to give a child, which is adversity. One tutor of his son, Jackie, said, it's like he was born to be an Asiatic prince. Like, I don't know what this guy's deal is. And this was someone who tutored the wealthiest children. So I think that I think there's a lot to unpack there, but certainly, aren't we all just living out our childhood?
Of course.
Yes. Washington's no different.
So first, I have two questions left. First, a practical one, and then we'll get to the last. Could you repeat your last 3 items that you left us with?
Oh, yes.
You got good note takers, good students.
Yes. Pride in the founding, a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short, and aspiration toward, for a better future. And those things are not exclusive. They can all coexist. And sometimes I have to say very quickly after Pride in the Founding, a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short. Because people, that is itself a divisive statement. But these things can exist together. And the healthiest of countries, the healthiest of people, can hold all these things at once. Complexity is not a liability.
So our last question is a teaser for your next book. You've got them hooked. Why JFK for your next president to write about?
So it's so funny because I take years to settle upon a topic. I was on a discussion tour last year, a 13-stop discussion tour, asking how should a president be for New America, the think tank where I'm a senior fellow. And well, let me answer this in a different way, actually. I've been thinking about this book since I was, right after college, actually. I've probably been thinking about this book longer than I've been thinking about Washington. There were questions about Kennedy, but Kennedy was just always going to, if you write a Kennedy book, it's a little like, it's a Kennedy book, It's a little sensational, it's a little, it doesn't feel like the most serious. So I knew I would get there, but I thought it would happen later, and then I accomplished some things in this book that I thought would take longer. And I started to really think that some of the issues, I don't just write a book to say it in my own words. There has to be something that I want to convey. And I started to think there are some things that don't make sense about historian. I thought about that, I think in my 20s, and I kept thinking about it, And the pandemic started, and I really thought about thinking about this question. Questions beget questions. And I found something that you will see. And then after that, I just kept finding things. And it was very clear that was the book I had to write. Because the thing with all my books that they all have in common is, once I see something, I kind of can't unsee it, the way none of us can. But then I feel like if I don't say the thing that I saw, if I don't somehow intervene in the narrative, then I am complicit in the thing I don't like, which will tell you a lot about me. And then I have to do it. So that is why I'm writing this book. But I'm actually, a sort of funny note, as a presidential historian, I'm only going up to 1957. So I'm not going to the presidency because I do feel like the presidency has been really well done. But probably a much easier way to answer that question, because when you go on book tour, you get good at this kind of elevator pitch, and probably what I learned in this moment is that most biographers say that a president had an evolution. That's certainly true for Washington. And I have never agreed with them. No one says that Kennedy had an evolution, and I see one, and it's really interesting. And that is why I'm writing the book.
You've left us on a great cliffhanger. Y'all, give her a round of applause. Thank you so much.